All right, good evening, everyone. I'm Dan Tishner. Whoop, I've been warned to stand back, but we need to figure out so you can see your notes. Anyways, I'm a senior scholar and program director here at the Wayne Morse Center, and tonight's event is part of our Bookmarks series, which features authors whose works powerfully address political, social, and community issues. I want to underscore that the Wayne Morse, thank you, that's much better, that the Wayne Morse Center does not receive dedicated funds either from the university or the state. So our work depends on donations, so this is my plug that if you support these kind of events or things like the Wayne Morse Scholars Program, please consider making a gift to us. So our star author tonight is CJ Pascoe of our own sociology department. As everyone here knows, her talk will focus on her outstanding new work, Nice is Not Enough, Inequality and the Limits of Kindness at American High, which was published by the University of California Press. She's the author of numerous books, articles, and chapters, and I could probably spend about 15 minutes, if not more, describing this impressive body of scholarly work, but I think you all want me to get on with the show. I do want to highlight that CJ's work is award-winning, including the American Educational Research Association's Book of the Year Award and recognition from the American Sociological Association's section on sex and gender for earlier published work. Her research has been featured by media outlets such as Frontline, National Public Radio, USA Today, The Wall Street Journal, the Toronto Globe, and Mail, and Le Monde. And her work has been translated into Chinese, Portuguese, and German. She clearly is a very impressive scholar, and we're so lucky to have her here at the University of Oregon. So I know CJ has been on a book tour for Nice is Not Enough, so please join me in welcoming her home.
Thanks for inviting me to do this. I've been speaking to my friends about this particular talk, and I'm always woefully underprepared for how much more anxiety-provoking a hometown talk is than when you're off sort of speaking to strangers. So thank you for having me here. So I want to start the talk by acknowledging that kindness is having a moment. From a line of Crayola markers, to t-shirts and signs at Target, to kindness clubs at high schools, being nice is in vogue. But more than being in vogue, as David Brooks suggested in a recent essay in The Atlantic, kindness may be a solution to many of our pressing social problems. He recently wrote that meanness, in fact, is the emotional crisis of our time, an emotional crisis that scaffolds, in his mind, the general crisis of our democracy. Given what I saw during my 2 years of research at a working and middle-class public high school in Oregon, it seems like Mr. Brooks is not alone. Not only is kindness treated as an antidote to things like bullying and racism in schools, it's also treated as a solution to a wide range of social problems. Now, on the one hand, of course, there's nothing wrong with this. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that we shouldn't be kind or that we should be meaner to one another. But after spending 2 years immersed in a school where a regime of kindness characterized school culture, I want us to think a little bit more about the work kindness does, because I'm not sure it does what we think it does. In fact, I would suggest, based on my time at this high school, a school I'm calling American High School, that kindness itself is a way we avoid discussions of inequality. Even more than that, it's a way we make systemic inequalities look like individual ones that can be changed if we are just nice enough, not ones that require fundamental shifts in how our institutions, organizations, and society itself is arranged. Fundamental shifts that would require not just individual level nice, but would require us to think about systemic ways of responding to human need. That said, as someone who spent years studying homophobic bullying and heterosexist harassment in schools, I was elated when I walked into American High, a mostly white but simultaneously the most racially diverse school in its district, a school with about 1,000 students, that is the subject of this new book, And I saw these student-generated signs plastered on the walls under a banner reading, "No room for hate." If I hear any homophobic comments, I will ask, why does it matter to you? If I hear people making racist jokes, I can ask them to stop. If I see another person physically harassing someone else, I'll speak up and I'll protect the victim. If I see or hear a sexist comment, I will step in and say, how would you feel if that was you? American High is just that kind of school. The kind of school where there is no room for hate. The kind of school where love and kindness characterize school culture. I saw manifestations of this kindness and acceptance at every turn. Students had founded a Be Nice Club to promote kindness and inclusivity. On Valentine's Day, as you can see here, the cheerleaders plastered blue lockers with white notes and hearts on them, reading, "Have a wonderful day," or "You are an amazing person." In the girls' bathroom, it wasn't unusual to find posters like these, a cacophony of student-generated affirmations filling a large piece of yellow butcher paper. Given this culture of kindness, it's little surprise that when community members talk about American High, they call it a special place. Lauren describes American as full of the sweetest people in the world. Lila says that students would burn everybody alive if they were mean. Everyone stands up for each other. I think it's awesome. It's like, oh, you're homophobic? That's not cool. You're a bully? That's not cool. Similarly, Devin describes American as full of violently accepting people. As Emily, the mom of an American High student, says, folks at American will accept the bejesus out of you. This culture of kindness and acceptance among students and staff create the sort of school that students want to come back to after they graduate. In fact, when meeting with seniors to prepare them for the upcoming graduation ceremony, Principal Walt, a 50-something year-old balding white man with an easy laugh who frequently sported multicolored bow ties, he said to them that even if they miss the staff after they graduate, they can't just come back and hang out with your teachers after graduation. And after spending 2 years in the classrooms and hallways of the sporting events of American High, it was abundantly clear to me why so many students wanted to return to hang out for a bit with their teachers. The sense of kindness and acceptance at American makes it a place that's hard to leave. But as I discovered during my time there, this kindness and acceptance has limits. Limits that became clear when young folks and staff took stands against systemic racism, when young folks demanded safer schools and inclusive mental health care, when girls grappled with gendered inequalities and harassment, and when long-standing rituals shifted in attempts to become more inclusive. In other words, what was happening at American High was a little more complicated than what was going on in the hallways, a complication that became clear to me on the day of the annual senior assembly. Now, like most assembly days, the day of the senior assembly, students were let out of class during second period, and they made their way over to the gym to find their seats in the bleachers that lined the sides of the gym. The staff, as they usually did, gathered by the glass doorways at the entrance to the gym. What happened next, however, set off a series of events at the school that reflected the limits of this culture of kindness. The show choir took the floor and they began to sing, as they typically did, the national anthem. Teachers, staff, and students stood, some removed their hats, others placed their hands over their hearts. But as the choir neared the end of the song, a slight rustling occurred in the group of staff members to my left. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Max, a middle-aged white man with short-cropped brown-gray hair and the only out-trans teacher at the school, slowly drop to one knee. Several staff members turned their heads towards him, and slowly and quietly, about 5 of them, some white, some black, also dropped to one knee, in a now recognizable movement popularized by NFL player Colin Kaepernick to protest racially motivated police violence. Not a single student joined in this protest, and few even acknowledged that the teachers were doing this. When the anthem ended, the kneeling staff members rose, and the assembly continued as if nothing had happened. The apparent normalcy that followed that kneeling, however, belied the emotional and social weight of that brief protest. Nella, a beloved teacher who led the school's only ethnic studies class, later told me that the weight of the decision to kneel was so intense that she shook as she knelt. So, while it may seem surprising that at a school full of violently accepting people, the decision to kneel, at that point, a multi-year nationwide protest against racist police violence would be heavy enough to cause a physical reaction, the ensuing response to the kneeling staff provides some important context. Community members weighed in with the editors of local news organizations, parents shared their thoughts, the principal expressed displeasure, and the teachers who knelt received formal reprimands as letters from district leadership were placed in their personnel files. According to Max, the letters served as warnings that should this behavior continue, it would constitute a fireable offense. According to the letters, making a public statement against racist police violence constituted a, quote, act of political expression, and that political acts like these were forbidden during the workday. American High may be no place for hate, but it's no place for politics either. At a school where people will accept the bejesus out of you, kneeling to protest the murder of Black Americans becomes not an issue of hate, acceptance, or justice. It becomes an issue of politics. Now, this wasn't the only instance during my time at American that a concept of the political was invoked to quell actions related to social issues. On the football team's social media page, for instance, it read, "We are here to have fun and focus on athletes, not on politics or anything destructive. We will not tolerate negativity, profanity, or references to race, religion, or sexual orientation." When a beloved white teacher, Seth, wrote an email to his colleagues concerned about, in his words, rising racist, sexist, transphobic, homophobic, and xenophobic rhetoric, he was instructed to discontinue using email for, quote, political discussions. When young students plan to memorialize lives lost to gun violence and advocate for safer schools after being forced to sit through annual soul-crushing lockdown trainings, the principal wrote in response to their planned walkout, "Politics in the schoolhouse is not okay." When students in the Climate Action Club made plans to participate in a global youth protest to demand action on climate change, they were told they cannot put up these flyers because their walkout demanding a habitable planet was too political. Cameron, a senior member of the Climate Action Club, made the astute point, however, that school authorities do allow some political projects. He said, "There's a Young Republicans Club. That's actually about politics." And Cameron's point is an important one because it raises the question of what we mean when we call something political. His analysis suggests that it doesn't actually necessarily have to do with these formal processes of governing or political parties. And after spending 2 years participating in the social world of American High, I would suggest that what is going on in that schoolhouse and schoolhouses across the country is profoundly political, and that this emphasis on kindness and acceptance is a way to avoid whatever it is we mean when we call something political. These messages of kindness that blanket the school, from the cheerleaders' notes to the Be Nice Club to the claims that American is full of the sweetest people in the world, stop short of including space for sentiments, acts, or expressions considered political. Intolerance for hate has limits, in other words, and those limits are signaled by the political. Sociologists who study culture, which is to say our beliefs, our values, and our way of life, point out that the political has long been seen as a contaminant in terms of American civil discourse, violating the rules of politeness and threatening our ability to sustain community. Politics, as the quote from the football team's social media page suggests, is a priori destructive. However, as Cameron so aptly points out in his critique of the way the Republican Club is not considered to be political by school authorities, the political is not always the same as partisan or formal politics. So what is it? Well, as sociologist Andrew Perrin points out, political talk is talk that specifically addresses issues of power, resource distribution, or public morality. In other words, when we call something political, we don't mean necessarily capital P political. We mean social inequality, values, who deserves or receives resources, whose voices and needs count, and who gets to make decisions about these things. Inequality and the ideologies that justify or challenge inequality are the things, in other words, of politics. So if political talk is off limits at American High, what fills in for it? A language of kindness and acceptance. And the school's embrace of this sort of kindness culture exists without seriously addressing the racial, sexual, gender, or class inequalities, precisely those issues so often regarded as political. And this leaves school members without a language to address many of the very inequalities that such a culture of kindness should ameliorate. This avoidance of political topics in favor of individual solutions of love and kindness reflects, in many ways, how we think about inequality in the US in general. We think of inequality as an individual problem, one that can be solved by hard work, and one that is located in the minds, attitudes, and behaviors of individuals, rather than one that is baked into social institutions, educational, religious, political, or economic institutions that constitute our society. So what I want to do in the rest of today's talk is to dive into a set of stories about American High that can show us how, even in a school full of well-intentioned, violently accepting people, a regime of kindness can reproduce inequality and make systemic problems look like individual ones. And I want to do this not because American High is unique or because this is solely a school-based problem, but because I think what is going on at American High is representative of a much larger cultural dynamic. At American High, systemic problems come to look like individual ones through a politics of protection, or the way that dangers, threats, or harms to young folks' safety are framed as external, random, or individual, not necessarily as preventable, systemic, or related to social inequalities. In other words, rather than addressing systemic social problems or precisely those things that are in the realm of the political, we seek to protect young people from violence, bullying, and mental health crises by dealing with these things as if they have little to do with larger social inequalities. Students, for instance, suggest that racial inequality is sugar-coated at American High as part of a larger project of benign diversity, in which love and kindness are deployed to solve the problem of racial inequality, and in which many forms of difference are treated as equal to many other forms of difference. Girls are left to navigate edicts of kindness as they embrace a girl boss feminism, a sort of gendered resilience with which they confront a mundane misogyny, or the daily onslaught of symbolic, discursive, and physical gendered violence to which they are subject. Race, class, and gendered privilege intersect in the production of a student citizen, a production in which privilege gets disguised as merit and obfuscated by an ideology of tolerance. But I promise you, this is actually not a sad story. Sociologists are really good at telling those. What I also saw at American High were the seeds of and potential for a politics of care, an approach to power, resource distribution, and public morality that centers human needs, vulnerabilities, and systemic disparities, an approach that addresses the structural roots of problems rather than relying on individual responses like kindness and acceptance as solutions. We see these seeds in the demands by students like Cameron to discuss social problems, and in the tireless work of some staff members to address inequality, democratize opportunities for students, and clear organizational space for their civic engagement and sometimes civil disobedience. So in tracing out the dynamics of a regime of kindness, I think we learned something not only about this particular school, but about America itself. And most importantly, how we might approach the solving of some of the entrenched problems we are currently confronting. Speaking of the entrenched problems we are currently confronting, I'd like you to come with me to an event that I attended early in my time at American. On a cool January night, I attended the first drag show put on by American High. Drag, of course, has taken on outsized importance in recent years as drag events, including story times for kids, have been protested, often violently, and drag performers have been called groomers, pedophiles, and predators as part of a violent and rising wave of transphobic and homophobic activity sweeping the country. I conducted my research right on the precipice of that wave, just before we had seen 14 states introduce or attempt to introduce anti-drag laws targeting queer communities. And even in that seemingly more accepting time, to have a queer tradition like a drag show occur with the approval and support of a public school was a deeply important moment. So on this January night, a local drag troupe called the House of the Ridiculous Absurd, and about 10 students from the GSA, or what used to be a gay-straight alliance, now are called Gender and Sexuality Alliances, and several teachers joined together to put on a drag show for, by my count, about 70 or so family and friends, which was a smaller audience than the one that was attending the basketball game next door, but notable nonetheless. The young folks had worked for weeks to put on this show, even though their advisor, Rose, a young bisexual teacher with pink hair, wasn't sure they could pull it off. She told them to be aware that drag doesn't mean the same thing to somebody who is not in queer culture as it does to someone that is. You're going to go in there and ask for permission to do the show, and the adults are going to think that you're going to do a weird sex thing on campus. The GSA members convinced the adults that it wasn't a weird sex thing, that it was an important cultural tradition, and got approval to do the show. They contacted the local drag queens, they practiced their dancing, they learned how to put on makeup, and the result was a charming and understated drag show and a celebration of queer life. Queen Quixotic, the mother of the House of the Ridiculous Absurd, served as the MC of the event, and she explained to the audience, many of whom were first-time drag show attendees, how to behave at a drag show, what gender is, and what a drag family is. She told them that she had grown up in San Diego, and she would have never been able to experience something like that when she was a kid. She told the audience how the queens worked and turned and practiced with the students. She taught them how to walk in high heels. She taught them how to do a drag queen wave. And then she said of the show, "It will be fierce," after which she taught the audience how to show appreciation by snapping and saying yes and having them practice after her. At the end of the introduction, she said, pointing to her long dress that she was wearing and big styled hair, she said, "Many people think that drag is this, but it's not. Drag is the performance of gender. It's the performance of our identity." And with that, the drag show went on, opening with a queer-identified but assigned male-at-birth student in a burgundy bob and an ill-fitting purple dress, dancing around the stage to the Selena Gomez song, "I Love You Like a Love Song, Baby." This student was followed by students in drag as the Schuyler Sisters and Aaron Burr. And then a cisgender straight teacher played a ukulele and lip-synced. And it concluded with the only out trans teacher at the school, Max, performing a Billy Joel song that ended with him transforming from wearing a feminine white dress to wearing this transsexual menace t-shirt in homage to the iconic and influential direct action group of trans activists, an act that elicited elated cheers and applause. At the end of the show, Queen Quixotic came out and said that she wanted a safe future for our gender-diverse siblings out there. Please never stop being yourself. Please keep doing you. See these people around here? They all support you. The lights came up. Lady Gaga's gay anthem, Born This Way, came on the loudspeakers. The students rushed the stage. Their arms were in the air. They were waving their jackets around. They were dancing exuberantly. And I saw an enthusiasm there that I rarely saw outside of sporting events and proms. However, and perhaps not surprisingly, in the weeks following the drag show, Rose, the GSA advisor, shared with me that some parents were not happy and some admins were not happy. The principal got a few phone calls from parents who were not at the show, learned of it later, and had some questions about it. But the negative response wasn't limited to the parents. More surprisingly to both me and the members of the GSA, The district equity coordinator, Vanessa, also expressed some concerns. At a GSA meeting after the drag show, Rose shared these with us. First, Rose said, Vanessa was concerned that trans students would be the target of public outrage should there be a pushback to the drag show. Second, Vanessa suggested, such a show could be offensive to trans students themselves because drag usually consists of cisgender, and here Rose used air quotes, cisgender folks dressing as the opposite sex. Third, Vanessa was concerned that the drag show might lead to forcible outing and bullying of trans students if someone asked to borrow a trans student's wig. Now, the students in the GSA were not having this. They kept interrupting Rose with, what? And huh? Two students at one point broke out with, but I'm trans. And they sort of laughed at this response. And indeed, about half of the regular attenders of the GSA did not identify as cisgender. So in addition to their responses of disbelief, students also commented about how powerful it was for a cisgender male teacher to participate in this drag show, and for a trans teacher to participate in this drag show, especially by placing his drag in a legacy of trans activism. So to be clear, the district equity coordinator is right to be concerned with transphobic bullying. We all want our trans youth to feel safe at school. And right now, roughly 60% of queer youth nationwide report being bullied or harassed based on gender expression. However, the way safety for students gets translated here reflects the politics of protection approach I mentioned earlier. Threats to trans students are seen as individual ones, forcible outing, and mean, intolerant peers. They are not seen as institutional ones, the ability, say, to participate in a meaningful cultural tradition and feel like your identity and culture are organizationally supported and recognized. Now, this wasn't happening because the district equity coordinator was bad or mean. It was happening because of a particular cultural logic. This is a cultural logic that tells us that the problem for queer kids is bullying, and that dressing as the opposite gender can be a form of bullying, which it absolutely can outside of a particular cultural tradition. But what relying solely on that cultural logic does is that it prevents young folks from participating in an important queer cultural tradition out of a misguided sense of where safety threats come from. The idea that they come from individual mean kids and not from a systemic inability to participate in queer traditions like drag means that we see this as an individual problem where a systemic problem also exists. And in trying to solve the former, we unwittingly sustain the latter. And we may perhaps find ourselves instituting policy that has an effect similar to some policies, like those anti-drag bills working their way through multiple state legislatures, to which we may find ourselves deeply opposed. These cultural logics that allied systemic inequalities in favor of individual ones don't just affect queer or trans youth. We see a similar dynamic regarding racial inequality at American High, but with an even deeper emphasis on love and kindness. Take, for example, the annual Martin Luther King Day Assembly, an assembly where student affinity groups like Latinos Unidos or the Black Student Union present analyses of systemic racism and describe ongoing fights for social justice. One year, this assembly featured a video of mostly white school members answering the following prompt: "We need Martin Luther King Jr. Day because." Few of the answers to that prompt focused on racial justice, and instead they centered sentiments of love and kindness, like, "We all have the same heart," or "My friends and family are my world." And we saw something similar in written responses to a Black Lives Matter memorial that had been mounted at the school honoring lives lost to police violence. In these written responses, we could see things like, "Why can't we all just love one another, no matter what we look like, who we love, or how we identify? Kindness matters," or please be kind to one another." This sort of framing of racial inequity as a matter of individual hate or love was so pervasive that two students, Nicole and Angelina, actually have a word for it. They call it sugarcoating. As Nicole said, everything at our school is sugar-coated. We never get to learn about slavery because it's sugar-coated, or we can't learn things about racism because it's sugar-coated. Nicole is on to something. At American High, racial inequality is framed as an issue of offense, opinion, difference, or kindness, rather than exclusion, power, or domination. When issues of racial inequality are sugar-coated in this way, it leaves young folks like Nicole and Angelina with few tools to make sense of racial inequality in general, much less the inequality they experience as Latina and Pacific Islander students. The result is that a language of offense fills in for other silences around race at American High. If the problem is offense or hurt feelings, then the solution is not to be offensive. The solution to racial inequality, in other words, is to be nice. When offense and kindness are divorced from discussions of power and inequality, diversity becomes a matter of difference, opinion, and perspective. Take, for example, the time student leadership sponsored a Spirit Day, one of those days where students are supposed to dress as a theme, right? A beach theme, or a 50s theme perhaps, or a single color sometimes, to show school spirit. The theme student leadership had proposed for an upcoming football game was tourist. But along with this theme, they issued a warning. They said the theme this week can include stereotypes. If we can all be generous and not stereotypical, that would be great. We all want our Hawaiian students to not be offended in any way. They warned students to be cautious of grass skirts and coconut bras, saying, "We know this is not what people of that culture wear on a daily basis. It is a stereotype, and American High stands against that." And then they exhort students to come dressed in your best tropical beachy touristy gear, and they will be giving out some leis at the game. A language of offense does several things here. First, it centers hurt feelings rather than highlighting the historical nature of colonization that renders this sort of racialized cultural extraction a problem. Second, the message focuses on the good intentions of the presumably white students who are referred to as we, who would not want to deploy offensive stereotypes. However, the announcement in general seems to equivocate, asking students not to offend while also endorsing behavior that is absolutely problematic. This frame of offense serves to individualize systemic and historical racial inequalities in the name of fun. So when offense becomes the frame for racial inequality, it means that students and staff who advocate for multiple years to bring a Black Lives Matter display to the school run up against claims of offense. Right? The school resource officer opposed for multiple years the bringing of this Black Lives Matter display to the school because he felt offended by the display. And as a result, one school official suggested an emotional healing process, a healing circle, actually, as a suitable option to deal with systemic racial injustices rather than a Black Lives Matter display that documented racial inequality and rates of police violence. When offense becomes the language of racism, it means that diversity itself becomes less an issue of historical marginalization and more a recognition of difference, a sort of benign diversity. This means that when a group of students shows up to a Martin Luther King Jr. Day assembly wearing Make America Great Again hats and sits in the very front row, there's no public response issued. Because, as one mom puts it, it turns into this weird, well, you have to honor my diversity of being a MAGA person. You're the hater if you don't want me to wear this hat in your face. Diversity, in this sense, becomes less about the purposeful inclusion of historically excluded groups of people and quite simply becomes about difference, regardless of power differentials or inequality. When racial inequality becomes a problem of offense, opinion, and difference, kindness becomes the solution. This leaves students like Tara, a white senior, concerned that she will be unkind. She says, it's kind of hard because we have to be super careful, especially me being white. I have to be even more careful. I hate offending people. Seriously, I hate offending people. We should all just freaking love each other. Why can't it just be like that? Racial inequality in this sense becomes a problem of hurt feelings rather than an inequality from which white people benefit. And this sugarcoating of racial inequality can have devastating effects. When a group of public health officials, school staff, and students were convened to address youth suicide and mental health concerns, for instance, I watched as concerns of students and staff of color were repeatedly sidelined. Cassia, a member of this group and president of the Black Student Union, continually asked for health programming that would take racial inequalities into account. However, she said that in this particular group, she and other students of color would sometimes not talk for a while because, she said, when we were talking about slavery and stuff, it felt out of place. Even though, as Cassia pointed out, slavery affected people. People's kids got sold right in front of their eyes. And despite her requests and others' requests to focus on the connection between racial inequality and mental health, the group continued to focus solely on race-neutral interventions that not only contradict the data that suggests that racial inequality shapes mental and physical health, but also a focus that eventually led to the exit of all students and staff of color by the end of my time there. A culture of kindness allows a certain kind of racism to thrive. The sort of racism that sugarcoats the horrors of racial inequality, suggests that this inequality is a thing of hate and of the past, and allows white students, and in the case of the mental health group, adults, to passively and sometimes actively not know about racial inequality at all. I watched in classrooms as white students simply checked out when issues of racial inequality would come up. They'd sharpen pencils, or in the case of one, or sharpen pencils, leave the classroom, put in earbuds, put their heads down on desks. Or in the case of one white student, when she was told to write an essay about 6 words about race, she said, well, I'm not going to include anything about race because I don't like talking about race. It makes me uncomfortable. But it wasn't only white kids who checked out when they found discussions of inequality uncomfortable. I saw similar results of a regime of kindness when it came to gendered inequality and sexual harassment. I watched, for instance, as the football coach, Coach Ted, who without any training had been charged with teaching the human sexuality class because he had good relationships with students. I watched this as he tried to introduce a discussion of bystander intervention in sexual harassment. After sharing a story about how he learned how to not use homophobic epithets when he was younger because he learned that those were mean, not funny, he asked the assembled about 30 students in his class if they had ever heard people talk about women in a problematic way, and if so, what they did about it. And much like many of the white kids did in discussions of racial inequality, many of the boys put their heads down, put in earbuds, or closed their eyes. They just checked out. But the few boys who did remain engaged shared responses to me that seemed to echo the frame of offense that we saw in terms of racial inequality. Xavier, for instance, said that on the bus on the way to the football championship, he heard some sexist comments. And he said, I could have said something, but they also could have just not said it. They were arguing and stuff, and I didn't want to jump into it. Everyone has a different point of view. Jerry continued this conversation by saying, depending on the person, I don't know if you have the right to say anything to anyone. If it's some person you've never met before and you were trying to call them out on their bullshit, it's like aggressive or something. Jerry's comment suggests that the very nature of confronting sexist language may be aggressive. In other words, confronting sexist behavior may be seen as just as aggressive as the sexist behavior itself. Boys' responses echo these messages of kindness that shape American High. Sexist behavior is unkind, but so is confronting it, which makes both of them bad. When kindness becomes a solution to social problems, it can cloud the inequality that is at the heart of these problems. And believe me when I say that sexual harassment is a problem for girls at American High. As Holly told me, every girl I know has a story of being harassed, abused, or something. I don't hear that with boys. Catherine, for instance, told me that she received a request from a boy to buy used Nike shorts from her and her friend Natasha, and this request was accompanied by a picture of her and her friend Natasha, taken without their knowledge at one of their soccer games. Natasha, for her part, had learned that a different picture of hers had been taken and used on a social media website without her permission, but that she's trying to confront it as a compliment rather than identity theft. It's funny. Morgan told me that one time she went to the hospital because she was taking care of her mother, and the nurse kept looking at me and winking at me, and I was like, "You're disgusting. I am 16 years old. What is wrong with you?" It was so weird. Madison said, "A lot of people get surprise dick pics. It's kind of disgusting. It's tragic. They don't even ask. Guys think that we would just enjoy them sending us a random picture of," and she trails off. Tara laughed cynically as she told me that getting requests for naked pictures was such a common one that if I could count the number of guys and I got money for it, I'd be a gazillionaire. Girls tell me story after story about harassment, but they rarely call it harassment. The language young women use to describe this behavior is striking. Creepy, gross, stupid, appalling, annoying, sad, disgusting, tragic, and most commonly, weird. They repeatedly avoid using terms like power and inequality to describe the sexism, harassment, and misogyny they experience. Their stories and the language they use to describe it illustrates not only the everydayness of the sexism, but also what I came to think of as a girl boss strategy they use to respond to it. A set of individual strategies that both minimize this behavior and also seeks to curtail this behavior. They block people on social media, they laugh uneasily, or they call the behavior weird. And when they respond to this behavior, to set boundaries around it, they also draw on logics of kindness and anti-bullying language to do so. Take Natasha's experience, for example. She found herself on a date with a boy named Evan. And on this date, she said that Evan was being super gross, and he kept whispering gross things to her in her ears. And after they went to a movie, she found herself in a car with him, and she was not able to draw the sort of boundaries she wanted to in her physical relationship with him in that car. And she told me, "I should have been more against it. I should have stopped it from getting anywhere." But given that she wasn't able to do that, her response was to ghost him afterwards and speak to her friends to try to make sense of the experience. However, the fact that she was talking to her friends got back to Evan, and so he published a series of harassing posts saying, exposing Natasha part 1, exposing Natasha part 2, which Natasha described as posts on why I was the worst person ever. And so reflecting on her experience with Evan and her attempt to draw boundaries with him, Natasha said to me, "I feel bad about this, but when he tries to hang out with my group of friends, I never want to be a bully or anything like that, but I've had to disinvite him from things and be like, you can't come." So even though Evan behaved in ways Natasha found deeply uncomfortable on her date, harassed her on social media, and refused her requests to stop, she's the one who's afraid she might be a bully. Unfortunately, the training young women receive from the school about how to manage sexual harassment and sexual assault tends to actually reflect and encourage these individualist girl boss responses. In one training, they are told by an elderly guidance counselor with little training in sexual violence that non-mutual sexual contact has been exploding because of cell phones, and the pictures on their phones can be used for nefarious purposes. So, you should watch what you're doing with your cell phone and what people are doing with theirs so you don't end up on theirs. Unfortunately, as the girls' stories indicate, many of them don't actually have a lot of control over what happens to their pictures or who takes pictures of them in the first place. In the same training, young women are told that the popular reproductive rights slogan, "Your body, your choice," means not that you have the right to control your body in the face of state repression, but it means you have the responsibility to have an exit plan when it comes to sexually unsafe situations. So in this context, a feminist phrase designed to critique state control becomes transformed into a sort of girl boss motto in which young women are held responsible for preventing the sort of harassment to which they are regularly subject. As the girls' stories indicate, this approach is shockingly distant from their lived realities. And these girls at American are not alone. As the recent report from the Center for Disease Control suggests, the sexual harassment of teenage girls is rampant and is taking a devastating mental health toll. And a lack of organizational language or support around gendered harassment leaves these young women on their own to develop individual responses and prevention strategies regarding this harassment. As a result, Gendered harassment and violence largely gets dealt with in ways that avoid political content or explanations that have to do with power or inequality, including race and class inequalities. So what you should be picking up on by now is that this regime of kindness isn't just about a performance of being nice. It's the way that kindness gets built into school policy, practices, and cultural logics through placing priority on offense, feelings, and individual actions, and not inequality. This, effectively, in Nicole's words, sugarcoats inequality. The way this regime of kindness plays out in terms of student safety, racial inequality, and gender inequality combine to produce what we might think of as intersectional privilege, or the way in which race, gender, class, and sexual privilege come together to produce a student citizen, a production in which this privilege gets disguised as merit and obfuscated by an ideology of inclusion. Student citizens are members of the school community whose identities, knowledge, and skill sets are rewarded by the school and who can, in turn, harness the power of the school and its resources for their own ends. Student citizens can, for example, declare spirit weeks, which most students cannot do, leave class for non-curricular activities without punishment, something many students feared when they wanted to participate in gun control walkouts or climate strike walkouts. And they can take over the auditorium while dressed in drag, with no administrative comment, unlike the young folks in the drag show. At American High, the student citizens to which I'm referring are participants in the Eagle Pageant, a philanthropic school activity that's been going on for roughly 30 years in many Oregon high schools. The goal is to raise money through 3 months of fundraisers during a time they call pageant season. And this money goes to pediatric hospital units, and the pageant uses this catchy, weirdly pro-life phrase, saving babies, as its mantra. Pageant season culminates in, you guessed it, a pageant, but it's described as a reverse beauty pageant in which boy contestants perform humorous skits, typically dress in drag, and engage in competitions that have been arranged by a team of 8 girl coordinators who have actually made a 4-year commitment to running this philanthropy. These participants are regularly described as role models and heroes, and are, in the words of one pageant advisor, the face of the high school. Actually, yeah, back one. No, it was me, sorry. While the pageant is open to everyone, its veneer of inclusion actually clouds a process of exclusion that characterizes the production of a student citizen. As one of the coordinators said when hosting a meeting for potential pageant coordinators, and these girls who apply for a 4-year commitment of running the pageant, she says, all are welcome to apply. But I watched as Karen, a young freshman whose baggy jeans, t-shirt, and frizzy hair contrasted with most of the existing coordinators' well-done makeup, fashionable clothes, and long straight hair. And she asked, will you accept 504 students? Because I have Asperger's, and sometimes I struggle to organize things, but I'm working on it, and my parents are helping me. So while the pageant is open to everyone, Karen's multiple lines of gendered, classed, and neurological difference functionally worked to exclude her from participation, and her name didn't end up appearing on the final list of the final roster of coordinators. So this message of inclusion paired with functional exclusion characterized the pageant process in a way that made privilege look like merit. Participants were typically drawn from the honors track at school, these college-bound middle and upper middle class, mostly white students. These students needed parents who had money to give to this philanthropy. They had to be able to chip in for bunco night. They needed moms who could bake cakes. They needed families who had time to drive them to and from a multitude of restaurant fundraisers, car washes, and other events throughout pageant season. In fact, one of the few economically disadvantaged students who ever was able to participate in pageant was eventually asked to leave because the pageant coordinators were convinced that he was stealing from the can that contestants carried around to gather spare change from their school classmates. Miss Bay, however, a beloved teacher at American High, pushed back against the expectation that these students be economically advantaged. And she encouraged her class of mostly first-generation students to apply to participate in the Eagle pageant. She walked around her class one morning and said, as a statement, not a question, "You're going to the Eagle pageant meeting." She said, "People think you have to be a dude to do it, but just because it says Mr. Eagle doesn't mean you can't do it." And she said, "I don't mean this in a bad way, but I don't want it to be all Honors Academy people." And her exhortations to diversify the pageant worked. One of her students, Kat, a tall senior with short cropped blonde hair, who typically wore jeans and a sweatshirt, eventually became the first female participant in the Eagle pageant. She wasn't wealthy, she wasn't straight, she wasn't from an intact family, and her multiple lines of difference actually ended up highlighting the exclusive process of the pageant. The lead coordinator would often look at her and say, "The boys," and then Kat. Or, "She didn't perform the dances that the boys performed," because they often performed sexy dances where they hugged each other seductively to Britney Spears songs, and these were activities that simply weren't funny when a girl was doing it. She was often excluded from events that required that these young men be picked up at their houses because her housing situation was unstable and she was never quite sure where she was going to be sleeping that night, and they didn't know where to get her. So while there is nothing barring girls, working class, or queer youth from participating, the fact that boys dancing sexily is a joke, the fact that boys dress in drag for this performance also is a joke. This means that girls, queer, trans, and working class youth are functionally excluded from this event. But not only are they excluded from this event, they are also excluded from the resources and opportunities that flow to these student citizens. So when we see inequality as an issue of individual hate, bias, or prejudice, we miss the way it operates in organizations like American High and social institutions in general. But it doesn't have to be this way. And there are a lot of people at the school who are working to make it not be that way. There are people, in other words, who are working on developing a politics of care. Craig, the head security guard and one of the few men of color at the school, exemplifies a politics of care when he sits in the center of a school, his table covered in markers, paper for doodling, snacks that he gathers as part of an informal food pantry he funds with his own money, flyers for events like a workshop on institutional racism, or calling students by nicknames that he has for every single one of them, or him yelling at students to get to him essays that they wrote on their trip to a Black leadership conference. At one point, Craig even advised almost every single affinity group on campus. Ms. Bay exhibits this care when she helps her students strategize about how to join in a nationwide strike for climate change by using social media when they're told they can't put up those posters because they're too political. Or when she invites back to her classroom first-generation students to talk to her class about attending college. One student even called her care a weird, non-psychotic love. Max exhibits this care when, as the only out trans teacher in the school, he initiated the kneeling in support of Black lives, or when he supported his transsexual menace shirt at the drag show. Coach Ted exemplified this care when he tried, even without sufficient training, to initiate conversations about bystander intervention and sexual harassment. Nella exemplified this care as she taught the school's only ethnic studies class, working tirelessly behind the scenes to bring a Black Lives Matter exhibit to campus in the face of a lot of resistance. Or when she ignored the loudspeaker that droned on and on in order to guide students through an active shooter training, and instead started a conversation with them to help them process what it meant to grow up in a world characterized by gun violence. She exhibited this care when, in response to a student who said to her he didn't know if he should risk punishment to participate in a school walkout to protest that gun violence, when she said, "I can't tell you what to do," but pointed to her t-shirt which read, "I stand with students." And then she turned to her class and said, "There are ways to build systems that support you." And indeed there are. Building a system to support youth involves not just relying on these teachers' individual efforts to be the face of this care. Just like inequality is systematized, care needs to be too. It's not the responsibility of schools or individual staff like Craig, Coach Ted, Ms. Bay, Max, or Nella to reorient society around care. But as the experiences of young folks and staff I spoke with highlight, there are ways for individual schools to move towards a politics of care. So how do we build systems that support youth? We need to develop a language to address inequality. To do that, we need to do things like requiring ethnic studies classes, something that Oregon has begun to do. We need to employ people trained in sexuality and sexual violence to teach it, just like we do with other topics. And sexual violence and assault needs to be taught in terms of the inequalities to which they are related, gendered, classed, and sexualized inequalities. We need to move away from securitized responses to student safety and focus as much on incorporating queer students into the social life of school as we do with protecting them from bullying. Similarly, we need to move away from punitive tip lines with which students report bullying or harassment that are routed straight through to state police, and replace those with restorative justice processes that focus on repairing harm rather than on compounding inequalities. Similarly, we need to attend to mental health in non-punitive and culturally specific ways. We know that teens are in a mental health crisis, but the way we respond to it needs to be tied to larger systemic inequalities, not tied to punitive carceral structures. Finally, we need to attend to the social life of our schools, our assemblies, our rituals, our talent shows, our sports games, to understand how they reflect and sustain certain values and beliefs, as well as say something important about who and what matters in the social life of schools. The things I'm talking about here are bigger than schools. We task schools with too much, and we cannot expect them to solve society-wide problems like these. Public schools already do so much more than just educate. They are our social service agencies and our safety nets for young people in a society where a safety net is constantly pared down. They receive too little federal funding and are often staffed by overworked, caring, and exhausted employees. But currently, schools are battlegrounds, even schools where there is no room for hate. While the book bans popping up in state after state and the laws prohibiting lessons about racism and policies targeting trans students are not yet affecting American High, these policies are animated by similar logics to those that shape American High. Logics that draw a boundary around the political and what is appropriate for schools and what is not. In the wake of a sweeping book ban in Oklahoma, for example, a teacher was disciplined for making a political statement when she put up a sign over her banned books stating that they were banned. In Florida, parental fears about politicizing schools helped to pass laws that restrict the extent to which topics of race, gender, or sexuality can even be raised in schools. Across the country, fears of political indoctrination continue to echo in school board meetings as parents protest the inclusion of trans youth in the social life of schools. When we cannot talk openly about inequality in school settings, it constrains our ability to challenge laws that target already marginalized young people. When diversity becomes not a problem of inequality, but a problem of difference, then arguments about harm stemming from systemic exclusion make little sense. When political talk and action are banned, it leaves a void that gets filled with a regime of kindness. I think the story at American High suggests ways we might begin to center a politics of care instead of kindness in our organizations, institutions, and communities. After all, if inequality can be systemic, so can care. Thank you. I'm happy to field questions.
So we have time for questions or comments, so please jump in.
Thank you for giving me a moment to drink.
Yes.
How did you get approved to be at that high school, and what has the reaction been?
That's a great question, and I think I've researched about 10 different high schools at this point, so this is a question I often get. I asked. I asked the principal. I happened to know the principal through my social networks. And I said, I want to do this project. And what do you think? And the project initially started off as a slightly different one. I was really interested in teen dating and romance practices. But the principal and I sort of chatted for a year about the different sort of parameters and what I was really interested in. And during that time, Trump was elected. And so the entire political milieu shifted a bit. And so by the time I got there, things had shifted really at the school. A lot of the teachers at the school, as well as the principal, had read my previous work, so they sort of knew what they were getting into when I showed up. There was one student teacher who was lovely and kept going around to the students telling them that I was a celebrity. And the students were like, no, she's not. No, she's just a weird lady. So, yeah. And I also, one thing I do always when I research schools is I always try to offer something back because this is such a huge gift. And so earlier in my life, I always offered to tutor for like SATs or review college essays. And in this particular school, I offered to do whatever it was they needed, including being an on-call professor. And I sort of got to do that in classes. You heard me talk about one girl who didn't want to write about race in her essay. And that was, I often served as someone in that particular class who would read essays and sort of be an assistant teacher and kind of be support staff. So I tried to give back in whatever way I could. So, yeah.
And the school knows that this book has come out
Mm-hmm.
about them.
Yes. Yes.
And what's the reaction?
From the teachers I have heard from so far, fairly supportive. And I sent, and some of the students who are in it, I sent the teachers who play a fairly big role in the book. I sent them iterations of what I was writing as I was writing it to make sure that everybody felt comfortable and to allow them to say, can you change this? And there were a couple things that I was asked to change in terms of some identifying characteristics. I changed a lot of identifying characteristics. So it made me feel a little bit more secure in what I was reporting on, given that many of them had seen it and had the opportunity to weigh in to be like, you're getting this wrong, don't do that. So.
Since folks were slow to raise their hand, I want to jump in with one. So you do a beautiful job of kind of describing American High as every American high. But I wonder, is there a version of like American urban high, American rural high, American southern high, American western? In other words, how generalizable do you see this, and what kind of variations would you suspect you might have if you beamed into a different high school in a different region or a different place? Right,
so this is a question, again, as someone who's a school ethnographer and I study one school at a time, I get a lot about everything I write. And we know that sort of urban and suburban schools are different, right? Rates of bullying and harassment are much higher at suburban schools. Schools where you have a lot of homogeneity, where you have a lot of students who are the same, you have much higher rates of bullying and harassment than you do at urban schools. We know that in terms of homophobia especially. I will say that anecdotally, I gave a series of talks in Chicago over this past year, and I had teachers coming up from out of the audience from the Chicago public schools, like, you wrote this about our school. We had the exact same thing happen with our kneeling, and I was like, because I didn't expect that there would be any sort of overlap between urban schools and, technically this is an urban school, but it's Oregon, so like Portland's barely urban. I didn't expect there would be an overlap. So in terms of how generalizable it is, I don't know, there might be a Pacific Northwest nice thing happening here, but there's also a Midwest nice thing, there's also a Southern nice thing. So I'm wondering if it's only the East Coast who's gonna look at this and be like, that's not us. So, I don't know, we'll see, yeah.
Thank you.
Not sure where I'm, yes, great, you, yeah.
What years did you write this? And do you think COVID and putting schools online could have had an impact on this, or in what ways?
Right, so I left this school just months before COVID hit. In fact, I was supposed to do some more interviews, and I didn't end up doing them because COVID hit. And I think we saw some interesting things happen. I think we are more attuned now to the emotional life of students than we were before COVID. It seems like we're a little more attuned to that. We certainly have some more federal funds to deal with it than we did before COVID, for right now at least. I think we had a chance to see both how school operates as a lifeline and a social safety net in a way that was a little bit more invisible to some folks before COVID. But we also had a chance to see rates of bullying of some queer youth drop drastically. When you look at the GLSEN analyses of queer youth's experiences, their rates of bullying drop way, way down. However, lots of those queer youth were then also stuck at home in places where they couldn't sort of have their correct pronouns used or their correct names used. And so I think what COVID did was really highlight the way that schools do so much more than educate. And I think is really a call for us to treat them as full social service institutions and not just places where kids' brains are trained. And I would like to see that happen. I don't quite see it happening yet. That's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for a great talk. I wanted to ask you more about freedom of speech. You kind of referred to it in the benign diversity category, but I wondered if there was more to say. I feel like that is a framing that gets pulled out often here in high schools.
Right. And so I think this is a question I get often, right? I think this question of free speech is an interesting one because when we label something free speech, then other frames cannot apply to it, right? All of a sudden, hate speech and harm go out the window, right? And I think this becomes especially difficult in an age where it's not just speech, but it's symbols. And so when you have a Make America Great Again hat, right? Craig turned to me at one point, Craig, the security guard who sits in the center of the school and takes care of all the kids, he turned to me at one point to talk about those kids wearing those hats. And he said, they used to wear white hoods and now they wear red hats, right? And I think that statement is powerful on multiple levels. And one of those levels is that we wouldn't allow kids to wear white hoods because we see that symbol as a form of hate speech. And the hats right now aren't in that hate speech frame. They're still in this freedom of speech frame, right? Even though the meanings that are embedded in them in many ways are forms of hate speech. They say, we can't say we're anti-trans, we're anti-immigration, right? We're anti-voting rights laws, right? There's a whole set of things embedded in there that are incredibly dangerous and hateful. And so I think what we're witnessing is a moment of a symbol moving from a free speech symbol to perhaps a symbol of hate speech. And I think in the middle of that moment is when things become especially tense, right? When we're deciding which frame should be used around it. So that's my thought.
Jocelyn.
Hi, I couldn't help but notice that your study was based in a co-ed school. I personally went to an all-girls school, St. Mary's Academy in downtown Portland, and I couldn't help but notice with discussions surrounding gendered inequality and sexual harassment, how do you feel like your data would fit in within an all-girl or an all-boy gender context?
So I love that question. And you may not know this about me, but I studied boys and homophobic harassment for 2 decades. So I think about single-sex schools a lot. And when I started doing that work, California had a lot of, I was doing California, and California had a lot of single-sex school initiatives. So what we know about single-sex schools is that they're great for girls. Single-sex schools are great spaces for girls. And in many ways, they're great spaces for girls because it removes this harassment from the everyday school moment, right? Now that kids have cell phones, that never fully goes away. We also know that single-sex schools are horrible places for boys. They're awful places for boys. That we see the discipline problems multiply, the personal stories that many boys tell of single-sex schools are not great, right? That sort of aggression and harassment and dominant behavior that we see enacted on girls gets enacted on other boys. There are exceptions to this. Specifically, I have been told stories of sort of social justice dedicated Jesuit schools that set a really different tone, and it largely comes from the leadership down, and those schools can be very, very different, but they're not representative. And so I think what we see is that cultural definitions of masculinity are still seriously problematic, right? And that when you are able to protect girls from the ramifications of those definitions, they do great. But when we subject boys to a magnified cultural moment of masculinity, it's horrible for them. It's horrible for them, it's horrible for other boys, right? Which I think is really a call to continue to keep shifting these definitions of masculinity, in which we require boys to be dominant, heterosexual, competent, and to enact those things in fairly violent ways, but sort of on themselves, on girls, and each other. So, yeah.
I'm really interested in the relationship between the experience of oppression and inequality and mental and physical health. And I was wondering if you saw similar individualizing tactics in the treatment of mental health issues in your high school as you did about politics.
Interesting. I mean, mental health was not seen as an issue of inequality, right? So Mental Health Awareness Month, as it is in many places, maybe a little bit here at U of O even, is characterized by things like, chalking on sidewalks and puppies, which I love, but puppies, lunchtime yoga. So all of these are good things, right? But the students themselves often felt like their needs weren't being heard. There was one girl, especially the girls that I spoke with, one girl just sat there crying and saying, I feel like everything I have to do is a backpack full of bricks and I just want to set it down. And these sort of high-powered girls at the school, mostly white, mostly upper middle class, that was a sense they had a lot, that they had to be in charge of everything, they had to be perfect, they had to put up with all this harassment, and it just felt like so much. And I will say nowhere in any of the mental health discussions did I hear anything about sort of gendered harassment and mental health. And as I had sort of shared, I didn't hear anything about racial inequalities in mental health, even though we know, at least for a time, that Black girls were the sort of most quickly growing group that was suffering from suicide. And in fact, Black youth are often, there are sort of increasing calls to pay attention to Black youth and suicide because they've been so overlooked in that literature. I will say the one time I saw systemic inequalities addressed in mental health was when it came to trans youth. The school and that particular mental health group that I was talking about was deeply concerned with suicidality in trans youth. And my hunch is that because the model of trans youth is of a group of young folks who is always potentially a victim of suicide, that was a much easier way in to demonstrate care for trans youth, right? Care for trans youth that couldn't, say, then be translated into cultural inclusion. George Latham, I forget his first name, Latham. I'll come up with his first name in a second. He writes about the singularity of trans youth, that often trans youth are seen in this sort of one-dimensional model, that they're always potential victims. But this other model, right, as a young person who could be included in the social life of the school is less easy to see. Does that make sense? So it's interesting that's the one time we see systemic inequality appear in the mental health discussion. So, yeah.
I want to first say thank you for those of us who work in schools or with schools. This is a beautiful tool for us to start with, especially those of us working. I have a question about, I'm thinking about the staff members who were attempting to infuse this
Thank you for asking, and also thank you for all you do. I really appreciate you, and we all appreciate you. That's a great question. I will say that for the students who were activists, who were really tapped in, it really forged a solidarity and an alliance, and it was really experienced as an act of love. I can think of a group of students, for instance, ended up making this massive poster for Craig because they were so thankful for everything he did for them, including, doing the MLK assemblies, including playing a role in bringing the Black Lives Matter display, including kneeling, all of those things. They were just so deeply grateful for him. And the students of color especially regularly noted that Craig and Nella were the two people who they knew cared so deeply for them, and that they were their role models. And so the more engaged activist students didn't seem, it's interesting, I'm thinking about it, nobody felt like it was a betrayal by the school. I think they already sort of felt like, we get dual messages from the school. They care about us, but also they won't let us do this stuff. And so I think they really saw those adults as sticking their necks out for them, and sort of protecting them in a way, right? Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah.
Can I ask an historical question?
Oh, no.
Which is maybe
You know I'm a
switch-
sociologist. We
But-
don't believe in history.
My question is, do you think the regime of kindness is really an artifact of our time? Or if we went back in time 20 years, or if we fast forward in 20 years, it might have a different kind of regime? But what do you think that, we have these parallels, or this is something really unique?
I do have an answer to this one, actually. So because I've been studying schools, for over 20 years now. And so when I think about the first book I wrote, right, when I walked into high school in the early 2000s, it reminded me of high school back in the 80s. It was like the kids versus the grown-ups, and the teachers were just like, oh, God, these kids. And the kids were like, screw you, teacher, right? It was just like this battle, right? Which maybe for those of us who went to school in a certain time, this sounds familiar, right? For those of us who went to school more recently, it doesn't. And bullying was everywhere, but nobody used the word bullying. I wrote 200 pages about homophobic harassment and gendered violence, and I used the word bullying one time. And the reason I used the word bullying one time is because the kids didn't use the word bullying. The teachers weren't talking about bullying. The kids weren't talking about bullying. Nobody's talking about bullying, even in this milieu that was totally characterized by harassment. So it was in the early 2000s. By the time we hit about 2005, 2006, bullying is starting to be everywhere. The national discussion, even when you trace the use of the word bullying in the New York Times, it shoots sky high. And we see it peak about 2010, 2011, which is just after cell phones saturate the teenage market. And so we see this rise in discussion of bullying, along with a rise of adoption of this new technology that allows young people to live a life outside of their parents' gaze, right? So we have this sort of national techno-panic, I think, about bullying. I promise you I'm getting to the answer to this. So what I think we then saw happen was a response to this bullying, because nobody wants bullying, right? So like Lady Gaga starts this Born This Way foundation that I was a part of, that's all about sort of kindness and being brave is being kind. And I raise that because I think that's when we see kindness start to take off. That bullying, we responded to bullying with calls to be nice, not with calls to not homophobically harass people, right? So the discussion and the responses to bullying became this kindness discourse, right? If we just love each other, and schools had sponsored these like big assemblies where students would make these anti-bullying pledges, and everybody would cry, and nobody was gonna bully anymore, and everybody was gonna be nice to each other, and then of course they just, it worked about as well as virginity pledges did. But I think that's when the sort of 2010, 2011-ish is, I think, when we start to really see this niceness, kindness discussion start to take off in response to what people were calling a bullying epidemic.
Thank you, it's awesome.
So, thank you, CJ.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk to you about the whole history, but I actually have a different question
Great.
about whether the culture of kindness problems for schools. I know you study K through 12. I'm a little more familiar with the next stage, which is college students. But I'm wondering whether the obligation to inculcate the culture of kindness has superseded other institutional obligations, like to educate our students, for example, or what does education mean? And I'm just thinking of a very particularly current example. I'm sorry, it's on the higher education level, but just in the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of commentary about organized students on the college and university level. This I'm sure is happening in high schools as well, expressing themselves about the war in the Middle East. And a lot of it, I think, is very striking how strongly student collective protest is demanding that the primary obligation of their college or university is to be supportive of them in a way that sounds very familiar, very much like what you were describing, that they're not being cared for, supported, their voices aren't being heard. That's kind of the tone of it. So I'm wondering if you think that what we're seeing, at this particular moment of student protest is in part, a product of what's happening in K through 12. And what that means for those of us who are, whether we work in K through 12 or higher ed, who believe that there is something, at least in addition to caring, being kind to our students, that is part of what we signed up to do.
Yeah, we don't talk a lot about caring in higher education, right? We often get, we're trained as if we're brains and that our students are brains, and that caring isn't necessarily a part of what we do, right? And I think that's shifting. And I hear that shifting. We even just did a bunch of interviews for our department in terms of hiring, and the number of times care came up in the interviews, I was like, oh, this is changing, that's great. That said, what I actually am hearing in your question is a question about how organizations can carve out, hold space for students to engage, to practice civic engagement, right? Which isn't necessarily agreeing with students, but how can we create these institutions, including high schools, that have space for civic engagement, right? And so when we hear things like, oh, we can't take a stand on that, we're political, I started digging around to see what other schools did with these gun control walkouts or the climate strikes or Black Lives Matter. And there are schools that designed entire curricula around it. Many of the Seattle public schools, not that I want to embarrass Seattle, whatever, but there were schools that designed entire curricula around these things. Right? So not necessarily taking a stand, but definitely unpacking so that students could make sort of informed decisions and have it as a discussion. My friend David was a school teacher in the Bay Area, and his students during the March for Our Lives, they wanted to do a march, they wanted to do a protest, and so they designed a whole unit around civil disobedience and gun control, and so that's not the answer for college, but to me it begins to point us in a direction about how to support, enable, and clear organizational space for students to do civic engagement or to even do civil disobedience. And I feel like that is a form of care, right? It's not necessarily a form of kindness, but it's a form of care, clearing that organizational space for them. So, yeah.
Yes, last question.
The framing of kindness and niceness, just from your presentation, it's like it's got huge limitations. And so I'm sitting here thinking about what's the framing that would be a better framing? And
Well, and I think that's why I end with this politics of care, right? I think that if we approach, I think kindness for me feels like an individual response that, and other scholars have written about this, right? The way that kindness can be used in the service of white supremacy, et cetera, et cetera. But I think where I ended up, because I didn't want to be the person who argued against like being nice, right? That seems like a very uncomfortable position to be in. But that care seems like something that could be organizational, institutional, and systemic in a way that kindness feels very individual and affective. It's a sort of emotional response versus an organizational response that we can systematize, which is care and the meeting of human need, which I think speaks back to maybe what you were talking about, right? How do we meet human needs systemically rather than relying on these individual moments of goodness, if that makes sense? And individual moments of goodness that can be weaponized to sort of cover up more institutional badness, I think. So,
Thank you all for being here tonight, and please join me in thanking CJ Pascoe.